12 hours remain. In the high priest's palace, Jesus stands beaten and mocked, his face swelling from the blows, blood trickling from his nose and mouth. In the courtyard outside, Peter stands by the fire, trying to warm himself, trying to convince himself he's not a coward. He's denied Jesus twice. One more denial, and the prophecy will be fulfilled. The sky is still dark. Dawn is still hours away. But somewhere, a rooster is preparing to crow. And when it does, Peter's heart will shatter. Peter couldn't stop shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. He stood as close to the fire as he could without drawing attention, his hands extended toward the flames, trying to look casual. Just another servant. Just another curious onlooker. Not a disciple of the man being beaten inside. He could hear them, the council members shouting accusations, the guards laughing as they struck Jesus, the sound of fists hitting flesh. Each sound made Peter flinch. John stood on the other side of the courtyard, trying to catch Peter's eye, but Peter couldn't look at him, couldn't face the disappointment he knew he'd see there. Peter had already denied Jesus twice. Twice he'd said, "I don't know him." The words had come so easily, too easily, as if 3 years of following Jesus, 3 years of miracles and teachings and transformation could be erased with a simple lie. But what choice did he have? If they knew he was a disciple, they'd arrest him too, maybe kill him. Better to lie and live than tell the truth and die. Except, wasn't that exactly the opposite of what Jesus had taught? Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Peter pushed the thought away and moved closer to the fire. Maybe if he stayed quiet, kept his head down, no one else would notice him. But then a man approached, a relative of Malchus, the servant whose ear Peter had cut off in the garden. The man stared at Peter, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" the man asked, his voice loud enough that others turned to look. Peter's heart stopped. This wasn't a curious servant girl. This was someone who had been there, someone who had seen Peter draw his sword, someone who could identify him as a violent follower of the arrested man. If Peter admitted it now, he wouldn't just be associated with Jesus. He'd be guilty of attacking a servant of the high priest. Terror flooded through him. "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said, and his voice was too loud, too desperate. "You're one of them," another person chimed in. "I can tell by your accent. You're from Galilee like him." They were closing in. Multiple voices now, multiple accusers. Peter felt trapped, cornered, like an animal with nowhere to run. "Man, I don't know what you're saying," Peter protested. "You were in the garden," Malchus's relative insisted. "I saw you. You're the one who attacked my relative." Panic seized Peter's throat. And then, to his own horror, he began to curse, to swear oaths, to call down damnation on himself if he was lying. "I don't know the man," Peter shouted, and his voice cracked with the force of the lie. "I swear to God, I don't know him." The words hung in the air. "I don't know him." And in that exact moment, from somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, a rooster crowed. The sound cut through the courtyard like a knife. Everything stopped. Peter froze, his hand still raised in oath, his mouth still open from the curse. The rooster crowed again, clear, unmistakable. And then, Through the doorway of the palace, Jesus appeared. The guards were moving him from one room to another, and for just a moment, Jesus and Peter made eye contact across the courtyard. Jesus' face was battered. Blood ran from his hairline. His lip was split. One eye was beginning to swell shut. But his eyes were filled with such profound sadness. Not anger, not condemnation, just heartbreak. And in that look, Peter heard Jesus' voice from just hours ago. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. 3 times. Peter had just completed the prophecy. "I will never deny you," Peter had proclaimed so confidently. "Even if all others fall away, I never will. I'm ready to die with you." And Jesus had simply looked at him with that same sad expression and said, "You will deny me 3 times." Peter had been so certain, so confident in his own loyalty, his own courage, and now he'd cursed and sworn and denied even knowing the man he'd promised to die for. The rooster crowed a 3rd time. The guards moved Jesus back inside, and he was gone from view. But Peter couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The people around him were talking, but he couldn't hear them. The fire was warm, but he couldn't feel it. The courtyard was spinning, but he couldn't steady himself. "I don't know the man." The words echoed in his head like a death sentence. Peter stumbled away from the fire, pushing through the crowd, not caring now if anyone stopped him or questioned him or arrested him. He had to get out, had to get away, had to escape from the memory of Jesus' eyes looking at him with such devastating love and sorrow. Peter ran through the gate, down the street, out of the upper city. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. Then he collapsed in a dark alley and wept. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief. Peter wept with loud, wrenching sobs that came from the deepest part of his soul. He wept until he couldn't breathe, until his throat was raw, until he thought he might die from the pain of it. He'd betrayed Jesus, the man who'd called him out of his boat and given him purpose, the man who'd walked on water with him, the man who'd renamed him Peter, the Rock, because he saw potential that Peter never saw in himself, and Peter had denied him 3 times, just as Jesus said. "Simon, Simon," Jesus had said, using his old name, "Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail." Peter's faith hadn't failed. It had shattered. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the city beginning to wake. Merchants preparing for the day. Pilgrims stirring for Passover morning prayers. Life was going on as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Peter had crossed a line he could never uncross. He'd broken a vow he could never unmake. And Jesus was in the hands of men who wanted him dead. Peter curled up in the alley, his arms wrapped around himself, and continued to weep. He didn't know that Jesus had already forgiven him, that Jesus would seek him out after the resurrection, that Jesus would restore him and give him a mission that would change the world. All Peter knew right now was that he'd failed, utterly, completely, unforgivably, or so he thought. 11 hours and 30 minutes remain. John watched Peter run from the courtyard, and his heart broke for his friend. He'd seen the whole thing, the 3rd denial, the rooster, the look Jesus gave Peter. And now Peter was gone, swallowed by the darkness and his own shame. John wanted to follow him, wanted to comfort him, but something kept him rooted to this place. He had to stay close to Jesus, had to bear witness, had to remember everything, no matter how painful. Because if all the other disciples had scattered, if Peter had denied him, someone had to stay, someone had to see, someone had to remember, even if it cost him everything. John moved away from the fire, away from the curious servants, and found a shadowed corner where he could watch without being noticed. Inside the palace, the illegal trial continued. John could hear Caiaphas's voice, loud and angry, demanding answers, could hear Jesus' silence in response to most questions. Silence. The lamb before its shearers was silent, just like Isaiah had prophesied 700 years ago. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. John had read that passage dozens of times, had heard Jesus quote from Isaiah 53 more than once, but he'd never understood it until now. Jesus wasn't fighting back because this was the plan, this was the purpose, this was why he'd come. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. A ransom. John thought about what that meant. A ransom was a price paid to free a prisoner, to redeem a slave, to buy back something that was lost. Jesus was paying the ransom price for humanity, with his own blood, and it was starting right now in this illegal trial, with these false accusations and brutal beatings. John heard a commotion inside and pressed closer to the window. Through the lattice he could see into the council chamber. They'd brought in more false witnesses. 2 men who claimed Jesus had said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Jesus had said that, John remembered. But he'd been talking about his body, not the stone temple, his death and resurrection. But the council was twisting his words, using them as evidence of blasphemy and sedition. Caiaphas stood before Jesus, his face red with frustration. "Are you not going to answer?" Caiaphas demanded. "What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" Jesus remained silent. His face was swelling now. Blood had dried on his beard. But his eyes, even beaten and humiliated, there was something in his eyes. Not defeat, not fear. Peace. Impossible, inexplicable peace. Caiaphas seemed enraged by Jesus' silence. He stepped closer, his voice rising to a shout. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." The room fell silent. This was the moment. The question that mattered. The truth that would either vindicate or condemn Jesus. John held his breath. Jesus looked directly at Caiaphas, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong despite his injuries. "You have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The reaction was instantaneous. "Blasphemy!" Caiaphas tore his robes, the ceremonial act that signified hearing blasphemy. "Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death!" the council members shouted, and then the beating intensified. They spit on Jesus' face. They blindfolded him and struck him repeatedly. "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" John wanted to look away but couldn't. This was the man who had raised the dead, who had calmed storms, who had fed 5,000 with a few loaves and fish, and now he was allowing himself to be beaten like a common criminal. Why? Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus had said that just hours ago at the Last Supper. This was love, not the easy kind, not the comfortable kind. This was love that suffered, love that sacrificed, love that gave everything. John pressed his forehead against the cold stone wall and prayed, for Jesus, for Peter, for himself, for all of them, for the strength to keep watching when everything in him wanted to run. 11 hours remain. Judas walked through Jerusalem's streets as dawn began to break, the 30 pieces of silver clutched in his fist. He'd spent the last several hours wandering aimlessly, trying to escape his thoughts, trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But the guilt was crushing him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jesus' face after the kiss, that look of profound sadness, that expression of love mixed with grief. Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Son of Man, the divine title from Daniel's prophecy, the one who would be given eternal dominion and glory, and Judas had sold him for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. Judas looked down at the coins in his hand. In the growing light of dawn, they gleamed mockingly. Blood money, because that's what it was, wasn't it? Jesus was going to die, and Judas had made it possible. He'd led them right to Jesus, had identified him with a kiss, had made the arrest inevitable. And for what? For silver. For disappointment that Jesus wasn't the kind of Messiah Judas wanted? Judas felt bile rise in his throat. He'd made a terrible mistake, the worst mistake anyone could make. He had to fix it, had to make it right somehow. Judas began running toward the temple. The chief priests would be there, preparing for the morning sacrifice. Caiaphas would be there, gloating over his victory. Judas would return the money, would confess his sin, would beg them to release Jesus. Surely it wasn't too late. Surely they would listen. He burst through the temple gates as the sun crested the horizon. The morning light felt like an accusation, exposing him, revealing him for what he was, a betrayer. He found them in the temple court, Caiaphas, Annas, several chief priests and elders. They looked tired but satisfied. The trial had gone exactly as planned. "I have sinned," Judas gasped, approaching them. "I have betrayed innocent blood." The priests turned to look at him, and their expressions were cold, calculating. "I shouldn't have done it," Judas continued, his words tumbling out desperately. "He's innocent. You have to let him go. Here, take back your money." He thrust the leather pouch toward them, the 30 pieces of silver spilling onto the stone floor with a metallic clatter. The priests looked at the scattered coins, then back at Judas. "What is that to us?" Caiaphas said dismissively. "That's your responsibility." The words hit Judas like a physical blow. What is that to us? They didn't care. They'd used him to accomplish their goal, and now he was nothing to them. Less than nothing. But he's innocent," Judas protested. "I betrayed innocent blood." "That's your responsibility," another priest repeated, and they began to turn away. They were done with him. Judas stood frozen, staring at the silver scattered at his feet, the coins that had seemed so important just hours ago, the money he'd thought was compensation for his wasted 3 years. Now they looked like what they were, payment for murder. "No," Judas whispered. No, no, no. He backed away from the coins, from the priests, from the temple. They would kill Jesus. The trial was over. The verdict was death. And nothing Judas said or did now would change that. He'd sold the Son of God for 30 pieces of silver, and the priests who'd bought that betrayal didn't care about his remorse. They'd gotten what they wanted. Judas stumbled out of the temple, his mind fracturing. He'd betrayed innocent blood. Innocent blood. Jesus had never sinned, never lied, never hurt anyone. He'd only healed, only taught, only loved, and Judas had handed him over to be executed. The weight of it was unbearable. Judas walked through Jerusalem like a ghost. People moved past him, going about their morning routines, completely unaware that the worst crime in human history had just been set in motion. And he was responsible. He passed through the city gates and kept walking, out into the valley, away from the city, away from everything. He found himself in a field, the potter's field, where they dug clay. It was empty this early in the morning, empty and silent. Judas looked up at a gnarled tree that grew at the edge of the field. Strong branches, sturdy enough. The thought that had been growing in his mind since he'd left the garden now crystallized into terrible clarity. Jesus was going to die because of Judas. Maybe Judas should die too. It seemed like justice, like the only possible atonement for what he'd done. He couldn't undo the betrayal, couldn't save Jesus, couldn't face the other disciples or face himself, but he could end it. Judas pulled the rope from his belt, the same rope he'd used to secure his traveling pack. His hands shook as he fashioned it into a noose. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty field, to Jesus, to God, to himself. "I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. Judas climbed the tree. Behind him, in the temple court, the priests looked at the 30 pieces of silver scattered on the ground. "It is against the law to put this into the treasury," one of them said, "since it is blood money." After a brief discussion, they decided to use it to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. They would call it the Field of Blood. And Judas Iscariot, who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had heard his teachings and witnessed his miracles, who could have asked for forgiveness and received it. Judas chose death instead. His body would be found hours later, hanging from the tree. 30 pieces of silver had bought a field of death, and the man who'd betrayed innocent blood became its first occupant. 10 hours and 30 minutes remain. Jerusalem was waking to what should have been a joyous day. Passover, the feast of liberation. The celebration of God's deliverance. But in multiple places across the city, different people were experiencing this morning in vastly different ways. In the high priest's palace, servants were cleaning up from the night trial. Blood on the floor from where Jesus had been beaten. Scraps of torn cloth. The chair where he'd sat, still warm. One servant girl, the same one who'd first questioned Peter, swept the floor slowly, troubled. She'd seen the prisoner heal someone in the garden. The guards had talked about it in whispers. A man's ear completely severed, restored with a touch. What kind of criminal performed miracles while being arrested? She didn't know. But something about this whole thing felt wrong. In Mary's house, she finally rose from her knees after a night of prayer. She didn't know the specific details. didn't know about the arrest or the trial or the beating, but she knew, with the certainty that only a mother can have, that her son was suffering. The sword Simeon had prophesied was falling. Mary began preparing to go into the city. She didn't know why or where, but she had to find him, had to be near him, even if she couldn't help. A mother's place was with her son, especially when he was in pain. In the Roman fortress Antonia, Pontius Pilate was receiving an unexpected message. The Jewish leaders wanted an audience. Immediately. Before the morning was much older, they had a prisoner they wanted Rome to execute. Pilate groaned. He hated dealing with Jewish religious disputes. They were always complicated, always politically fraught. But he was the governor. It was his responsibility. "Tell them I'll see them within the hour," he ordered, "and find out what this is about." His servant bowed and left. Pilate's wife, still in her sleeping chamber, woke from a troubled dream. She'd been dreaming of a man, a Jewish teacher, standing before her husband. And in the dream, blood had been everywhere, on her husband's hands, on the judgment seat, on the stones of Jerusalem. Have nothing to do with that innocent man, her dream self had warned Pilate. She sat up, her heart racing. It was just a dream, just a nightmare. But it felt like more. It felt like a warning. In the temple, the morning sacrifice was being prepared. A lamb, 1 year old, without defect or blemish. Its throat would be cut at the time of the morning offering. Its blood would be poured out on the altar as atonement for sin. The priest who would perform the sacrifice that morning had no idea that the real Passover lamb was at that very moment being prepared for his own sacrifice. One lamb would die in the temple, another would die on a cross. Only one of those deaths would actually take away the sins of the world. In various homes across Jerusalem, the remaining disciples hid in fear. James and Andrew together in a locked room. Thomas alone, wondering if he should have stayed in Galilee. Matthew in the home of a former tax collector friend, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Philip and Bartholomew together, praying but not knowing what to pray for. All of them racked with guilt for having abandoned Jesus. All of them terrified they'd be arrested next. None of them knowing that in 3 days, everything would change again. And in the palace of the high priest, in a small holding cell, Jesus sat alone. His face was battered. His body ached. He'd had no sleep. But in his mind, he was counting down. 10 hours until he would hang on a cross. 7 hours until the scourging. 5 hours until Pilate would say, "Behold the man." 3 hours until he would carry his cross through Jerusalem's streets. He knew every moment that was coming, every pain, every humiliation, every second of agony. And still, he whispered the words he'd prayed in Gethsemane. "Not my will, but yours be done." The sun continued to rise over Jerusalem. Most of the city had no idea that the most significant day in human history had begun. 10 hours remain. And Jesus is being taken to Pilate.